Hello and welcome to Project Zion. Today is the first podcast in a new international series, Grounds for Peace, under the auspices of peaceprojects.eu. In this series, we are asking what are the grounds, the foundations for a new peaceful humanity. I'm your host, Andrew Bolton, joining you from Leicester, England, and a member of the Community of Christ European Peace and Justice team. According to Steve VIII, President of Community of Christ, no matter where we start from as individuals, our calling, our purpose as a human species is to be a peaceful humanity. The phrase peaceful humanity is another way of saying Zion, or God's peaceful reign on earth where everything is right. Today, our guest is Richard Wrangham, a British academic currently working at Harvard University, Massachusetts. He's a professor of biological anthropology there. He's a scientist who studies primates, that's apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and humans. He's past president of the International Primatological Society and a fellow of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the British Academy. His book, The Goodness Paradox, How Evolution Made Us Both More and Less Violent, has just come out this year. Jane Goodall first went to Africa to begin her studies of chimpanzees 60 years ago today. And Richard was a student in Tanzania. Jane Goodall calls Richard's book a brilliant analysis of the role of aggression in our evolutionary history. So, Richard, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. I find stories of human evolution fascinating. And according to a DNA test I had, I'm at least 2% Neanderthal. There's history in our DNA.
There certainly is. It's so nice for you to have me today, because I think that as we think about these big problems of society, it's so helpful to understand something about what kind of species we are, where we come from, and the story about human emotional tendencies related to aggression is a story that's changing very fast, and it's really developing. So it's an exciting time understanding who we are and where we come from.
So given our human evolutionary history, the big question before us in this podcast is this: is it actually possible for us humans to be a peaceful humanity, or are our genes stacked against us? So let's begin looking at this question by first of all asking you to describe what you call the goodness paradox. What's the paradox, Richard?
The paradox about humans is in relationship to aggression, because we show such extremes. On the one hand, when you compare us with other species of animals, including our closest relatives, we're incredibly kind and tolerant and cooperative and what we would call good. And on the other hand, compared to our close relatives, we're also the most wicked and violent and cruel and rapacious of creatures as well. So the paradox is, how can we be both of these things? Because often we tend to think that there is a single scale of aggression, and an individual or a population or a species is at one end or the other. They're either, very aggressive or not aggressive at all. And we have both of these tendencies. So it's paradoxical that we can have both on a single scale.
So we're both incredibly gentle and calculatingly violent, and both are true of the human species. So if we were to put this together in another way, using the voices of two European philosophers, Englishman Thomas Hobbes argued that humans are nasty and violent and need a strong government to reduce their violence and make society possible. And then Rousseau, French-speaking from Geneva, Switzerland, said humans are basically good. It's civilization, people's environment that corrupts them. So are you saying that both Hobbes and Rousseau are right? Humans are both nasty and nice.
Yes, the thing about Hobbes and Rousseau is that they're both right and they're both wrong. There is Rousseau saying, or reputed to be saying, that we are born good and it is only society that corrupts us. Well, he's right that we're born good, but he's not right in saying that only society corrupts us, because I think it's very clear that within everybody there is the potential for, in some ways, what we would call evil, but certainly the potential for violence. So, for years, for 200 or 300 years, people have been fighting about, was Rousseau right or was Hobbes right? And we shouldn't be fighting about that. We should be lifting the good parts from either of them, the correct parts from either of them, and saying, well, both were right, but both were wrong too.
I find it fascinating that a natural scientist settles a philosophical argument that's been raging for 200 or 300 years. So I think that's wonderful. So what is the evolutionary story? What happened to make us humans both gentle and calculatingly violent?
I think the line that we come from is very clearly a line that of thousands of generations has been hunters. So, the story of human evolution is that a species that looks so like us that they could walk into a clothing store on Main Street in any town and they could buy clothes to fit them. Something that a species that looks like contemporary humanity in that sense emerged around 2 million years ago and was called Homo erectus. And the species that we belong to that is different from those earlier species of humans is called Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens emerged, some people say 200,000, some people say 300,000 years ago, depending on how you define the beginnings. Well, I want to distinguish between those earlier humans, starting 2 million years ago, and the later ones that we belong to now, Homo sapiens, starting, I think of it as 300,000 years ago. The earlier ones, including Homo erectus, were certainly hunters. And hunters are good at hunting prey animals, the antelope that they need to eat, and that makes them good at hunting in general, and they can hunt and kill each other. And there are lots of other animals that do that. Chimpanzees and wolves, hyenas, lions, they're good at hunting prey, they're good at hunting each other, and they kill each other. So then we got that angle of our aggressiveness. But then something else happened. And starting with our ancestors around 300,000 years ago, we see the first evidence for a species that has got a marked kind of gentleness as well. And the story here takes us into domesticated animals. So domesticated animals are always, compared to their wild ancestors, relatively unaggressive. They are gentle and relatively tolerant. We walk among them without risking getting bitten. And domesticated animals, doesn't matter who they are related to, they have characteristic features in their anatomy. I mean, one of the features that is very obvious is white patches on their foreheads and white toes they very often have, and white ends of the tail. There are all sorts of features like that, and floppy ears that we recognize very easily. But if we were to look inside their bodies, we would also see a series of anatomical changes. And these are important because there are anatomical changes that occur in domesticated animals that we also see starting to happen with Homo sapiens around 300,000 years ago. And these are a reduction in the total body size, a reduction in the degree of differences between males and females, with males becoming more like females. There are changes in the face, the face shorter and narrower, the teeth become smaller, and ultimately the brain becomes smaller as well. And all of these things happened starting around 300,000 years ago. And what that suggests, if we were any other species, and I think it is actually true, is we were becoming domesticated. So on a species that has an ancient history of being a killer, there became this new kind of trend of a domestication event that made us into something like a domesticated animal. And the story here involves two markedly different kinds of aggression. The hunting and killing kind of aggression is called proactive. It's premeditated, it's planned aggression. You stalk your prey, you stalk your enemy, sneak up on them and kill them and run away. The other kind of aggression is emotional, unplanned, reactive aggression. And this reactive aggression is the type that is so muted, so relatively unimportant in domesticated animals, and is so muted in ourselves. So this evidence of the way the anatomy has changed in the last 300,000 years to make us this new species on Earth, Homo sapiens, the evidence is that because of our anatomical changes, that signals the fact that we became relatively unaggressive from the point of view of reactive aggression. And just to tie this together with Hobbes and Rousseau, you can say that Hobbes was talking about our proactive aggression, the type that's been with us for 2 million years, and Rousseau was talking about our suppressed reactive aggression, which has been increasingly down-regulated for the last 300,000 years. So we emerge as a species with a high tendency for one kind, proactive, planned, premeditated cruelties, and on the other hand, a low tendency to just lose our tempers and blow up in the face of a threat. We are very much calmer than our ancestors would have been.
So we can fly across the Atlantic both ways, numerous times, 400 people on a plane, and there's no incidents. I've never seen an incident.
Yes, but of course, the funny thing about that is that nowadays you have to be checked for, several times before you get on the plane, because you might have a premeditated type of aggression. But we won't lose our tempers ordinarily, unless, of course, you have too much alcohol.
Yeah, very interesting. Yes, very interesting. So what's the mechanism? How did we become both?
Well, that's a fascinating question, of course, as to what is it that intruded around 300,000 years ago to start us on this astonishing journey towards becoming one of the most gentle animals on Earth. And I think that the evidence is overwhelming that the really important feature was that language became so sophisticated that individuals within these small social groups that our ancestors belonged to were able to whisper together and talk when there was a social problem. And the reason we can say that language seems so important is that we can turn to small-scale societies of hunters and gatherers or people living in very simple farming communities where they're isolated from any kind of government or intrusion of the modern state. And we can ask, how do they deal with the problem of somebody who is like our earlier ancestors, who was not domesticated, who was too willing to lose his temper, who was willing to use his physical strength to bully others and take someone's wife from another man, or to seize the food for himself, or just generally try and dominate others in the kind of way that actually an alpha male chimpanzee or an alpha male baboon tries to dominate their groups. Well, the answer, when you get some kind of intransigently dictatorial individual, is that the rest of the society comes together. They whisper to each other at times when he can't hear what they're saying, and they make a plan. And the plan is, let's get this guy alone at the appropriate point, and we will kill him. Now, many lesser mechanisms come into play before they get to that stage. They'll laugh in his face and try and persuade him one way or another to behave better. But if he doesn't, if he continues to be a really serious aggressor, then what happens is that some individual with the authority of the rest of the community will kill him, put an arrow in his back, or drop a huge rock on his head in the middle of the night, or whatever it is. And so now you've got a mechanism that is unique among animals, because no other animals can develop the kind of confidence in each other's willingness to help each other that they can arrange for this equivalent of capital punishment. Language is what enabled people to do that. Once they do it, once they have the language, then they are able to use their combined power to dominate someone, however aggressive they are. And so that's, I think, is what happened in 300,000 years ago. Language became so sophisticated that, as it were, the beta males were able to control the alpha males. And then the result of that over time is that there is an evolutionary process of natural selection, or call it social selection if you like, against the tendency to be hyper-aggressive, because those men start losing out. They die too young. And if they maybe do have some children already, then what can happen in terms of what we see in small-scale societies is that even their children might be killed, because people really don't like being dominated. So here you've got a very strange evolutionary mechanism which uses proactive aggression and, as a consequence, tends to lead to selection against the propensity for reactive aggression. It's Hobbes producing Rousseau.
So this is really quite a dark story, isn't it? So execution, murder, when the beta males gang up and kill the alpha males, creates both our gentleness and hones our capacity to plot, to calculate, to work together in a conspiracy at low risk to themselves, to murder. So where are you about the death penalty?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I want to make absolutely clear that this is an evolutionary analysis of where we come from, and it is absolutely not a recommendation for how we should behave. And my own feelings about the death penalty are clear. I think it is an outmoded system that we should abandon completely. The death penalty was something that was developed in the context of these small, independent, anarchic societies, very different from its use by the state. Because in the small-scale societies, where for tens of thousands of years it would have mattered enormously, these penalties were being carried out by people who knew each other. It might be a son against a father. It might be cousins. It might be whoever it is done in sorrow under difficult circumstances. But nowadays, with the state executions, there are all sorts of reasons for saying that they are not something that we should continue with. I mean, among other things, it doesn't reduce crime. The statistics do not give any indication that execution tends to reduce crime in the future. And at the time, it's a very expensive system. It's actually more expensive than keeping people in jail. But even more importantly, it's thoroughly unjust. Executions tend to be carried out much more on the poor and disadvantaged than on the wealthier. And nowadays, of course, there's a racist component to that. And then perhaps even more important than anything, it makes mistakes. And we now know that quite often executions in the past have killed innocent people. And then, of course, everyone regrets it. So I want to make absolutely clear that just the fact that in the past our species has routinely used capital punishment is absolutely no reason to think that it's a good idea.
So you're saying, I think, that our violent human past does not have to determine our future. To use a religious language, we're not predestined to be forever violent. So humans have choice. There's the possibility of peaceful religions and ideologies that give us new possibilities.
Yes, I mean, when people talk about having choice, choice is very difficult because it's got to be a choice not just among individuals within a society. So the whole society perhaps is able to come to a choice at the ballot box for a peaceful leader, whatever. But it's also got to be a choice between conflicting entities, between conflicting nations. And then the word choice is harder to use because there's something about the fact that if one society chooses to be peaceful, they have to rely on negotiation with the other society to make that effective. So it's not easy. But the big point here is that, we know perfectly well that there has been a tremendous decrease in the amount of violence that we've seen in the world on a percentage basis. That is to say that the proportion of people who die from violence, for instance, has gone down over time. And that alone says that there's no reason why that shouldn't happen in the future. The difficulty is that we come from a line in which we do have motivations that easily induce a willingness to think that we are morally right about a question and the other side is wrong, and therefore we should be violent. We should kill people on the other side because it's morally right to do so. And that problem will always be there. The short story here is that we have biological tendencies that mean that violence is never very far away, and therefore that we will always need to be really, really careful about designing our institutions and our treaties and our international relationships in ways that minimize the chances of violence.
So for us to be a peaceful humanity, it's very important for us to have some self-awareness of our evolutionary past and that we're on a short fuse, as it were.
I really think so. I mean, if you just take sort of one hideous example, you think about the French Revolution, and to the extent that that was motivated by the thought that Rousseau was right and that we're all very peaceful, if only we can get the chance to get rid of the previous bad people who were imposing some kind of violence on us, then everything will be wonderful. And of course, it never is. All of the revolutions lead to more violence in the future. And then you develop new social arrangements for suppressing the violence. It will always take work. It will always take fresh ideas. Our society takes fresh forms to be able to control our violence. And I think the helpful thing to think about here is that the kind of aggression that is so important in leading to war and genocide and all the really unpleasant things is proactive violence. And the point about proactive violence, whether you are a chimpanzee or a wolf or a human, is that you do not undertake it if you feel that there is a risk that you personally are going to get hurt. Now, in humans, that little formula is less optimistic than it might be in other species because people can be sent into battle through hierarchies that exist within the army and the state and so on by people who personally are holding back and not going to get hurt. But nevertheless, the general principle is that if the expected costs of a behavior are higher than the expected benefits, or if the risks of getting hurt are high, then the behavior is not undertaken. In other words, we do not have some kind of lust for violence. We don't have some kind of mad urge to attack regardless of circumstances. We're very sensitive to context. And if we can design the kind of society that acknowledges that there is always an underlying threat, but at the same time recognizes that provided we have a social arrangements in which people who are criminal in their intents and their violence will be held responsible, then there's real hope for a peaceful future.
So I find it really interesting to connect with Leicester and the Battle of Bosworth and Richard III, 1485, losing a war with the future Henry VII. This was a battle between two alpha males. It was a civil war. Then along comes Henry VIII, the son of Henry VII. Apparently, he had 70,000 executions perhaps in his reign, including St. Thomas More and two of his wives. And then in the 20th century, we have mass murderers Adolf Hitler, Stalin. And on the other hand, you have also strong leaders, Winston Churchill, this side of the Atlantic, Abraham Lincoln in the United States. Both of them believed in democracy most of the time. They were constrained by democracy, constrained by institutions of law and courts, elections, parliament, Congress. So there's two contrasts, two sets of alpha males, one not constrained so much and another constrained, doing much better, I think. So what about today? We have strongmen leaders like Putin of Russia, Duterte of the Philippines, Xi Jinping of China, Bolsonaro of Brazil, and Mr. Trump of the United States. And you've mentioned Lord Acton's famous axiom in another conversation, power corrupts and utter power corrupts utterly. Do you have any comments on the importance of democratic institutions in holding political leaders accountable?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, these are wonderful questions because they're so important. And, I don't want to portray myself as a political scientist, but I will say that in the end, the coalitional control that is exerted by democratic institutions or other kinds of institutions that somehow represent the will of a larger group of people is just absolutely fundamental. I should make a distinction, by the way, between the alpha males in a chimpanzee community, say, and the alpha males in human society of the type that you've been talking about, the Churchills and the Richard IIIs and the Putins. Because we call them alpha males in contemporary society, but they are not the same as alpha males in animal societies. And the reason is that humans are so coalitional. The only way that President Trump can become president of the United States is by organizing coalitions. It is not by exerting his own physical strength. Whereas in animals, they do use simply their physical strength. I mean, it's just an amazing thing. The way that an alpha male chimpanzee becomes the alpha male is by personally defeating in physical fights every other male in the group. And I think that's the way we should think about our past until we got the kinds of coalitions that led to us becoming domesticated 300,000 years ago. So now we've got a new kind of alpha. Now we've got an alpha who is the head of a coalition rather than somebody who does their own personal fighting. And clearly, the only way to control the new kind of alpha is by having rival coalitions that are able somehow to suppress the autocratic tendencies of these new alphas. And that, of course, is where institutions become absolutely vital and terrifyingly vulnerable in some ways, of course, because we all know of historical and even present-day cases where individuals manipulate their own coalitionary strength to the point where they can be put into positions of unrivaled power. And you brought up Lord Acton. I think that one of the features that we do inherit from our deep past is this tendency, particularly in males, maybe to some extent in females, for power to corrupt, and absolute power to corrupt absolutely. It's when you get unfettered power that you have the ordinary constraints on proactive aggression disappearing. And when they disappear, then all of a sudden, our willingness to commit violence in order to eliminate even quite trivial threats to ourselves becomes all too tempting. And so you can have, ferocious leaders like Stalin authorizing the killing of millions. That's the danger, of course, and it's why it's so desperately important to keep an eye on the institutional structures that do keep society from having the state monopolize power to its own extreme advantage.
So that's why human rights, national and international courts enforcing international law are so important for peace and justice, and an important way of curbing proactive violence. Given law and courts, there is hope for peaceful humanity. Law and courts with teeth, with power.
Yes, there's tremendous hope, and I think we'd always come back to the fact that we have had very peaceful societies in the past. You can have countries which for several hundred years can have extraordinarily low rates of violence. Iceland is a classic example, but then Iceland also, you can go back before the last few hundred years to the time of the sagas in 1000, 1100 AD, that sort of thing, and see terrible accounts of violence there. So these things change, but the overall trend is certainly in the right direction. It's just that we still have to be very careful, because the trend may be in the right direction, but there are still great dangers. One of the intriguing facts is that the longer that societies go without war, then the worse the war is when it eventually happens. That's a problem that we should be aware of.
Yeah, I agree. Can I ask a question about matriarchy? In the webinar, you said there were no matriarchal human societies that you knew of, although bonobos, cousins of chimps, are matriarchal. So is male rule inevitable in government, corporations, churches, and religions? Or is something more equal possible, not matriarchy or patriarchy, but joint rule? And I should declare that in Community of Christ, we have women at every level of the church and involved in every key decision. Half of our pastors in the UK, for instance, are elected every year, and they're women. So can you have joint rule? Well,
this seems to me to be a fascinating question, because it's one in which the trend that we see is at a much earlier stage than the trend for reduced violence. That is to say, we still have very few examples of societies in which women are equally powerful as men at the top. I don't know about the Community of Christ, but quite often what you find is that in businesses, say, you might have quite a lot of women in the executive branches, but the further you go towards the top, then the more the bias is towards the men. But there seems no reason why this should have to happen. It depends on people being sufficiently determined. And it's incredibly exciting. that since, I think it's 2003, we now have, for the first time, a country in which the parliament, or the top institution in the country, political institution, is numerically dominated by women. So that is Rwanda, when 46 out of 80 seats were occupied by women. But it's amazing. That is the first time in the history of the world that we know of, that we've got the ruling body, as it were, numerically dominated by women. There have been some cases now in Scandinavia where you have more women than men in parliament. So, in principle, it seems perfectly reasonable that this should continue. There will doubtless be pushback, and males seem particularly good at forming coalitions with each other. So, it may be challenging, but I don't see why it shouldn't happen.
So there's a bit of hope. So I want to ask...
by the way, you asked about matriarchy in the broader context. You brought in bonobos, which are the sister species to chimpanzees, and have this extraordinary set of contrast with chimpanzees, much less violent and much more tolerant, and much more females much more involved in the hierarchy. But most people, I think, would say that it's pretty equal between males and females. Most males can get beaten up by most females, and most females can get beaten up by quite a few males. The important thing in bonobos is that when these interactions happen, the females are much better than the males at coming to each other's help. So if a male and a female get into a conflict and they each squeak and ask for help, then the female definitely will get support from local females, and the male will not get support from the local males. So thanks to coalitions, the females. I now have all sorts of friends who are trying to think very seriously about how to resculpt some of the political systems and the legal systems in the United States and elsewhere, following the bonobo principle, to try and get women to support each other better in terms of all the kinds of conflicts where women have tended to suffer in the past.
Oh, very interesting. I want to explore another question that is to do with nonconformity. So nonconformist alpha males were murdered in the past. But what about courageous nonconformity of people like Quaker George Fox, conscientious objectors in wartime, Rosa Parks, who, refusing to give up a bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, started the civil rights movement, or Gandhi? None of these people were bullies. They were nonviolent, gentle people, but they refused courageously to be obedient to unjust laws or unjust norms. And these kinds of people have been quite important, particularly in the 20th century, for making human cultures better. Do you have any comments about the role of nonviolent, ethical nonconformists?
I think I have to take off my evolutionary biology hat here, because I'm not sure that evolution has much to say about it. The only thing I would observe is that in our evolutionary past, to judge from the way that small-scale societies have operated in recent years, it's been very dangerous to be a nonconformist. The power that the men in the group can bring to control the bullying alpha can also be used to control anybody that they don't like. And very often you see in quite trivial ways that nonconformists suffer. Someone who comes in with new ideas that challenge the traditions of the society can be exiled or killed. So in our evolutionary past, it's very likely that nonconformism has been so dangerous that there has been selection for people to be conformist, to not be the nail that sticks out. So I think that nonconformism is a somewhat unusual and somewhat brave position to take. the sort of significance of the particular types of nonconformists who argue for nonviolent and gentle approaches seems to me enormous. And that's partly because if they can persuade others to take a nonviolent approach, it turns out statistically that this is very effective. I don't know if you know the work of Erica Chenoweth.
Yes.
So, that's so impressive that nonviolent movements tend actually to be more likely to bring about political change than violent movements, provided you get enough people to come along. And so, the seeds of those movements are going to begin with the kinds of people you were talking about, the nonviolent, the gentle ones who work through persuasion to bring about essentially such a large coalition that they don't need to use violence.
Yeah, it's a capacity to appeal to the equivalent of lots of beta humans. That something is unethical. Bull Connor setting dogs and fire hoses on children in Birmingham, Alabama, and it was the headline news. That did more good for the civil rights movement because it appealed to people's basic sense of fairness, I think, in the United States.
Yes, there's that sort of cognitive appeal, and then at another level, there's the emotional appeal of once you realize that you've got lots and lots of people on your side, once you see a leader who is attracting lots of support, then your fear of being a nonconformist goes away. Yeah. And you can act on the way that you think is right, rather than out of fear.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. So this is an area for us to continue to explore, I think. I want to go back in the story a little bit. So Jane Goodall, I think, was the first to find this serious violence in chimpanzees. And then her supervisor and your supervisor was Robert Hind, who helped the story get out as well. And then you talk about a friend, a colleague, David Henberg. So none of you suppressed this story of chimpanzee violence. It got out. At the same time, Jane Goodall, Robert Hind, and David Henberg were also personally very committed to peace work. Would you like to comment on their stories?
Oh, thanks for mentioning them, Andrew. And I think it's a really interesting story, this, because those of us like myself who have tried to grapple with the question of what it means to discover that one of our two closest relatives, chimpanzees, makes deliberate efforts to raid and kill members of neighboring communities, we have sometimes been criticized by people who've got all the right motives, are worried about peace and war and aiming for nonviolence. And they say, you shouldn't draw attention to this, because if people think that we have got some kind of tendencies to make war that come from our evolutionary past, then they will just give up and do nothing. And it will leave people so pessimistic that the chances of war will just increase. So there was a kind of moral pressure not to talk about this stuff. Well, my answer to that is that the three people who were most involved as senior academics in this discovery all spent the rest of their lives very active in the search for peace. And I think it energizes you to know what the possibilities are. So Jane Goodall, she was really shocked when the discoveries started coming in of the deaths occasioned by the chimps that she had come to love and admire and enjoy so much. And when she discovered their dark side, what she said is, well, they're not as nice as I thought they were, but it makes them even more human. Well, she spent much of the rest of her life being a United Nations messenger for peace. She wrote her book, Reasons for Hope, where she explicitly lays out what it is about humans that means that we can have a hopeful future, thinking about particularly the young. And 300 days a year, she travels around the country, around the world, giving her optimistic perspective on humans, but also recognizing that we have dark tendencies and that we need to be sensible and take those into account as we develop our future. Her advisor, her PhD advisor, was Professor Robert Hind at Cambridge University, and he was a leading animal behaviorist, deep in the research science. But after this discovery, what he did was he kind of melded it with his own experience. His brother had died an awful death during the Second World War. He was always very anti-war, but then he became really engaged, and he became the chair and co-chair of the Pugwash movement to try and ban nuclear weapons. He wrote a series of books with titles like War No More, showing that for him, the lesson that humans have got an evolutionary component to our aggressiveness just meant that we needed to understand it better and to take all the more seriously the threats that we face. And David Hamburg, who was Jane Goodall's American advisor and was financially organizing grants to support the work in Gombe at the time, he did very similar things. He co-chaired with Cyrus Vance, who was the Secretary of State in America, a multi-year commission on preventing deadly conflict. He was involved in reducing nuclear arms. He was involved in working with Mikhail Gorbachev to bring the United States and the Soviet Union into a better understanding of each other and reduce the chances of the Cold War becoming a hot war. So these three people, the ones who, as senior academics, first appreciated the fact that humans are not alone in making war on their neighboring groups of their own species, and that chimpanzees are one of our two closest relatives, also do that. They responded by very positively, actively thinking about how to bring peace to the world. And I think that's a great lesson for how knowledge can really help.
So thank you. That's a really moving set of stories. William Wilberforce, the British Member of Parliament who led the successful campaign in Parliament to, first of all, abolish the slave trade and then actual slavery, is your great-great-great-grandfather, according to my research.
Yes, that's right.
I talked with your sister, Kate. He also said Kate helped found the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So concern for animals is a long history in your family. And we've already talked about Jane Goodall, Robert Hind, and David Hamburg, how they've been committed to peace and justice. The tagline for Peace Projects EU is, "What would you do for peace?" Could I ask you, Richard, if it's not rude, to ask, what would you do for peace?
Well, it's a question, I suppose, that all of us should be challenged with, and I don't feel particularly well organized to respond to it. Wilberforce is a very daunting ancestor to have, because in addition to co-founding the RSPCA, as you say, he was involved in supporting children, stopping working in factories. He was supporting prisoners. He was trying to stop excessive alcohol in the gin palaces. He was engaged in all sorts of things. He was just, nobody could be a better advertisement for a Christian life. it's hard to imagine anyone being quite so virtuous nowadays. At any rate, my own sort of contributions, I suppose, go in the direction of thinking about conservation. I find it very daunting that in the future, if we carry on as we're going as a world, then we are going to turn the entire surface of the planet into just a giant garden, farm, feedlot to feed humans. And I don't think that that's going to be a very nice way to live, and it's not going to be a very safe way to live either. So I think that the one of the components of a peaceful future is including a natural world which, if you like, can provide ecological services and act as a buffer for humans. It can provide all sorts of important biological sources that we need, resources. And it may also serve a really important emotional tie for humans to the earth. For one reason or another, at any rate, I am involved with conservation of chimpanzees. The forest in which I have been studying chimpanzees for 32 years in Uganda has the largest population of chimps there now. And I think that for the people living around the park, it's a benefit to them to be able to live next to the forest. What they would really like to do is to cut it down, and then within a few years, you wouldn't have a forest there at all. And the same thing would happen all over the world. I think that in future generations, their descendants will be pleased that they do have a remnant of the natural world right next to them, not just for economic reasons like bringing tourists, although that is important, but because to connect to that aspect of our lives it has spiritual significance. So I hope that among the many ways in which people work for peace, working for maintaining enough of the natural world to give people a sense of where we come from and a sense of enjoyment and appreciation of other species will always be one component.
Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing with us in this podcast. You've been incredibly generous in doing both a webinar and our podcast for us. My interactions with you have been consistently lovely, and I really appreciate that. I recommend your book, The Goodness Paradox, to our listeners. It's a very good read. I know people still have many questions from the webinar, and no doubt from this podcast. And some of those questions can be answered by reading Richard's book. This is a Project Zion podcast, and today I was your host, Andrew Bolton. Thank you for joining us. And may I, in closing, ask you, our audience, to consider this same question that I asked Richard. What would you do for peace? Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Andrew.